Here we go. All right, today I am joined with Mandy, one of my very good friends, who is coming to us today to talk about transitions, which I'm super excited because it's something I honestly feel like I don't know a lot about. And I am always like, I wonder what the answer would be. Be to that when you only work in like a K5 or a 5, 5, 6, 7 situation, and then you get to these high school settings, it gets a
hmm
little hairy for me. So I'm excited to have Mandy here today. Mandy has many accomplishments, and she's like, oh my God, Christine. The one that I know her very dearly for is Director of Special Education, and I'm going to brag on her a little bit. She is one of the best directors that I have personally worked with and learned, quite honestly,
Thank you.
most of the things that I know today from her and how
Just the correct things. Anything that you learn that's wrong, you can blame somebody else for that.
we'll blame Dave for that. Dave, if you're
Yeah,
listening,
well, I
no.
like that.
And honestly, how to navigate some tough waters with some tough families. I learned a lot from Mandy's very peaceful hammer style. We always kind of go, the velvet hammer is coming back today, right? Uh, of how I handle certain situations. It's so funny. People say that to me all the time, like, how are you able to do that? And I'm like, well, a lot of practice because I was not like this. Mandy can attest to that. I've always been kind of a go get 'em tiger kind of gal. Um, with meeting you, it was like, oh, look at how fabulous she handled that and just really modeling the way that I approach things with other leaders, other teachers, and different things like that. But I'm going to let
Well,
Mandy.
we've had some initiation by fire too. We've shared some pretty difficult cases together that I think we've both learned and grown from. So,
I honestly,
and bonded forever.
yeah, somebody asked me that the other day. I was with a psych and she was like, I would have never been able to handle it that way. And I was like, well, let me just tell you, when you learn, like you said, by fire, you
Yes.
you learn a lot of different things. I'm
Mhm.
gonna let Mandy talk a little bit about herself, which is what we all sometimes hate to do. But I think it's super important for everybody to hear your background and hear some things about you, and then we'll jump right in.
Yeah, I have been in special education in some capacity for the last 20 years, which is wild to say. This is year 20. Very exciting to be in this space and doing this work and really thinking about kind of how you grow and how you learn and how you develop. And really excited to talk to you about transition. A little nerd moment for me is that I actually did my dissertation around why parents select tuition-based transition programs. And it has been so helpful for me in working with teams, both families and case managers, really thinking about that transition thing. And Christine, you had mentioned something when we first started, like, oh, I don't know about that. And I would argue transition starts in kindergarten. Like that's what we're doing. We're getting students ready for life after the K-12, or if you do an 18 to 22 program after that. And so I'd say we all have a hand in transition and getting students ready for life outside of school.
That's a really good thing to think about. I guess I never have thought about it that way, but when you just said that, I was like, oh, I guess she is right, because we are kind of
Mhm.
planning those next steps
For sure.
instantly of how we're going to help that student progress through their education. And then, like you're saying, and beyond.
hmm
And I think that's a good way for a lot of our listeners to think about it too, because I think we hear transitions sometimes and we're like,
Well, that's something they do over there.
yes,
hmm
I could attest to that. I'm like, I'm not really sure about that, or what does that actually look like? And I'd love to hear more about what makes a good transitions program. And I think another thing too to think about is what students go to transition programs, right? Like,
hmm
what is that group? Because I think we think of a certain group in our heads as special education teachers, like, and then I also think there is another group of kids that actually might benefit from that programming
hmm
not always think of.
Right. And some of that programming can absolutely be done in high school, right? It doesn't have to be, it shouldn't be, we just do transition when they're 18 to 22, right? Like we
Yeah.
know we evaluate for transition needs oftentimes starting in middle school, but for sure by ninth grade. And then we're writing those transition IEPs. And I was talking to a team recently and I said, this is the framework. This is the framework in which we make decisions. And so it really solid transition programming isn't a place or a space. It's our plan for our student. And so it's really matching those goals that students have and parents. And so often they're more in tune than we give them credit for. They have some sort of idea. Whether they're willing to vocalize it or share it is another story, because a lot of times we get, I don't know, which
Yeah,
I think is really common and also fear-based. We'll get into that in a second.
for sure.
Um, and so it really is designing a program for them using that IEP process. So that framework should be applied for sure in ninth grade, if not before, right? What is it that we're setting them up for? And what are the skills that we need to develop? And when that's our framework, everything else kind of makes sense. It makes sense what classes we register for. It makes sense what experiences we should be providing. It makes sense what skills we should be building to help them reach that goal. Questions I get all the time are like, well, they changed their mind. You know, they want to be this one day and they want to be this the next day. And
Sure.
that's super, super normal. And so I would say you're just preparing for that. You know those skill deficits and how they impact those careers. And often the same, you can provide educationally for that, right? Like if you have a social skills need, it doesn't matter if you're going to be a baker or you're going to be a truck driver, right? You have to have those social skills in order to navigate those settings. And so it just really is that framework piece. And that I think has helped teams just know what to do next and to know that that planning starts right away.
Right. So a question I get a lot from special ed teachers is when do we start putting those transition goals on IEPs, right?
Mhm.
And what can they look like? Can they look like what you were just saying, a social skills goal that's kind of tailored to those transition needs so they're embedded together, or do they have to stand on their own?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. So as soon as you evaluate for transition needs, it needs to show up on that IEP. You've
Mhm.
established that there are these needs and these are the things that we're addressing. And I think that is a common misnomer that we just say it's tucked in this eval in seventh or eighth grade, but we're not really going to do anything until ninth grade, right? But we have this information, we have this data. And so you really do want to start setting up that IEP process to address those needs that you've evaluated, right? In an age appropriate way, right? We know that a seventh grader maybe doesn't have their whole life planned out, nor should they. So there are developmentally appropriate ways to manage that. As far as, you know, those skill deficits, I think it really is important for teachers and staff to understand what it is that is needed. And I think that just goes back to understanding your standards, understanding, you know, environments so that you can prepare your students to be the most effective in those settings. So absolutely social skills goals can align to transition needs. It doesn't have to be, I will live independently and here's my goal on independent living, right? We know that part of independent living is navigating Target and navigating the grocery store and picking out right, you know, like figuring out how you're going to get places. And
Yep.
so there are so many skills that you can develop using those IEP goals, but that really sets students up for that life outside of school.
Right. So would you say that those need to be separate or they need to, where would they live on the IEP is I think a good question for some of our new to transition special education teachers.
Good question. So when you write a transition IEP, there's a couple places. And MDE, I just have to give them a shout out, has really nice module trainings. In case anybody
Oh,
from MDE is watching this,
I hope
they
so.
have some really nice modules about each part of the IEP. So if you are new to transition, I do recommend that you do that, that you take those modules because they're nicely done and you're going to get all the compliance pieces and you're going to get some nice thinking points.
Mhm.
MDE also is pretty strict about like you can't say the student doesn't know. So you have to come up with something, which I think is challenging for our teachers. Um, Once you've identified what that is, and I'm just going to say, Christine will be a special education teacher, right? So there's a spot in the IEP called transition goals. This
Yep.
is different than your IEP goals. This is
Mhm.
stating exactly what it is the student wants to be. Sometimes we get a little stuck too about what's realistic and what's not. And I think we have to remember it's the student's goals. And so through our instructional experience, we're going to figure that out, right? So if Christine wants to be a special education teacher, then we know that. So in our present level, we can start saying, okay, here are the things that she needs to do to get ready to be a special education teacher, right? And that's how those two things work together.
That makes sense because I think that's where a lot of our teachers get hung up, or I see a lot when I'm looking through paperwork is I don't know, which is a
Mhm,
common answer, obviously, from some of these kids, especially at the
mhm,
younger ages when we're doing transitions. But I guess then that leads to my next question. What are your thoughts on, so we do transitions in middle school.
mhm,
When is it appropriate on an evaluation to do it again? Is it appropriate to do it again? Because that is something that's coming up a lot in one of my districts is we have these kids in these transition programs or going into, but yet we're waiving those evals and we're sitting
mhm,
there going, should we be waiving them? Because is that something that needs to be reassessed? Because like you're saying, could look different for the
mhm.
student or could look the same. I guess from your perspective, what are your thoughts on multiple transition assessments for students?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we are also a district that does a lot of do not evals, especially senior year, right? Like we've got all of this data. We know what their plan is. It's really hard to say, yeah, let's make them go through an evaluation.
Right.
However, we have actually developed a flow chart, and one of our bullet points on the flow chart of it, when we're determining if we should do an evaluation or not, is are there transition needs? And
Mhm.
are we considering a transition program? And if we are, we will often open up the evaluation to get the most current and up-to-date transition needs. Now, a lot of times that means we're record reviewing a bunch of things and we're just focusing on those programmatic pieces so that we have a new fresh set of data. So I tend to lean as a director towards making sure that you have the most current information that's
Mhm.
going to help your IEP team plan. So probably a Woodcock Johnson isn't always the most helpful for a senior who's going into a transition program and they want to do something vocational, right? And so I would say maybe we don't do that there, but I would say updated transition information is always important. And the other question that I want to make sure that I address for anybody who's listening, who's thinking about transition is when you get the students that say, I don't know, a career exploration goal is perfect,
Oh,
right? Use those surveys. There's so many free resources out there.
right.
And I would have students say, you don't know. Okay, when you come to my class next, we're going to have you take a few surveys. We're going to go over those together. And you're going to tell me if anything's popping out as an interest so that I have something to write on the IEP. So I want to make sure that I'm leaving some practical things for the IDK kids that are out there because we
There
know they're out there.
they are. They're for sure out there. So when you were talking before, and I don't remember if it was before we got on the call or right when we started, that your dissertation was really around tuition-based transition programs. And I guess for me, I would love to know like what are those? Because
Mhm,
I guess in my brain, I only think of those transition programs that we see in some districts because not all districts offer them. And we need to
mhm.
make that clear too. Like there are some districts out there that do not have transition programs for those 18 to 20, is it 22? 22
It's
year old.
22 now, the law changed. Yep. In
Yeah,
Minnesota, it's always been a federal law.
22-year-old students. And sometimes I think it is a privilege that some of them have them. So really, what is a tuition-based transition
Mhm.
program?
Yeah. So I'm going to get in the weeds a little bit, but talk about that when I was in the classroom, I actually had a transition class. I
Mm.
called it a transition program with juniors and seniors in high school. And so we would hop on a bus and we'd go out in the community and we did everything that you could think of, um, really focusing on those transition skills. It was like the best job. I just have to say, like, I loved it so much. And what I noticed is that most students would go on to the district 18 plus program, right?
Mhm.
And to varying degrees of success or interest or like this is just kind of the logical next step. But I had a couple parents that decided to do something different. And so there are a few tuition-based transition programs in the state of Minnesota, often housed within current colleges. Um, I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say on the YouTube. So,
Either. So we could just
um,
like try it and see what happens.
right.
We're all
Uh,
new to this.
So probably the one that I think most people are familiar with is the Bethel Build program. So they have a specific program housed within Bethel, and there's a couple others in the state of Minnesota. Iowa State is a big one too. They have a program that kind of has this inclusive manner. And so the question that kept coming up for me was like, why wouldn't parents just do the free one? Are they choosing this after? Like, why would they spend all this money on it? Like, what is the deal with this? And so that really is the question that sparked my dissertation. And it was fascinating. And so what I did was I had focus groups of parents that had completed or were currently in these transition programs around the state of Minnesota. And so I just asked them, like, why? Why did you do this? How did you land here? And it was astonishing to hear some of just the consistent answers across all parent groups was really this drive for their kid to be in an inclusive setting
Yep.
and a goal, a common goal of independence. And what parents said over and over again is that when you let your kid fly, they will fly.
Yeah.
And that they were so terrified and so scared. And they enrolled in these programs and they could do it. And so sometimes it just really comes back to that having that high expectation for our kids when it comes to independence.
Mhm.
It's so scary. You and I are both parents.
Yeah.
All of the things are terrifying. We're like doing driver's ed in my house. And so, like, that's
It does.
terrifying.
That
But,
is terrifying.
right? But that is like a natural part of independence. And we have to kind of let some of that go. When you
Yeah.
add on the layers of having a kid with a disability,
Hmm.
that's even more scary for parents. And so, part of our job is just showing up where they're at, supporting them. If your goal is this, how can we get there?
Yeah.
And I think we can replicate a lot of that within our 18 to 22 programs. Districts do have an obligation to provide that. So even if they don't have programming that's specific because they are such a small school or a rural school,
Yeah.
sometimes they co-op, sometimes they share, or sometimes they just have to create. So that is an option for all students that are in special education if the team determines it's a need.
So then when we say tuition base, who is paying that tuition base? Is that parents paying the tuition or the districts paying that tuition? What does
No.
it look like?
So this would be like a private setting. So
Okay.
parents, it varied from parent to parent. Most parents paid something out of pocket. Some
Okay.
use their caddy waivers. So if
Mm.
parents are connected through the county, they can write some of these plans and use caddy waiver money to finance these programs. And a lot of the programs had scholarships available and various opportunities for financial support.
Okay.
A lot of them have fancy fundraisers and galas and things like that to help scholarship students because it's expensive. College is expensive anyway, and
Yeah.
then you add in the extra layers of support a student with a disability might need. That it adds up. So I would say another takeaway that families did share was not to let the price tag scare you away, to keep looking and find a way because there are some pretty good opportunities between caddy waivers and
Yeah.
scholarships and things available.
Did you find that those transition programs were more robust than what a traditional school district was providing for students? Just as, and it's hard to say that, right? Because we don't want to
Yeah.
bash the public school system because we're all just trying to do our best and we're building
Mhm.
these programs and just doing what we think is best for kids. But I am curious if those programs did have more because they were privately funded or there was just a different way of doing things. It's just like when you go to private school versus public school, you get a different set
Mhm.
of,
Yeah, I think it's just different, right? I think what they offer that public schools don't offer is that you live there. They're living with college students. They're living on campus. So they're truly independent, whereas we're busing kids in and we're sending them home at night. And
right.
so the primary difference, to boil it all down, is that there is this, you're submerged in this transition experience, this adult experience that maybe isn't there when mom's doing your laundry, right? So uh that theme came up a lot. It made me chuckle. The laundry thing came up a lot with
Oh,
parents that
funny.
like, yeah, they liked when their kids went off because they could do their own laundry. So uh it was
Yeah.
that was just a funny one to me, but yeah.
Did you find that there was a certain group of students that fit better for those private, like tuition-based transition programs, or was there kind of an all-inclusive model for all students, right? That even our lower end students who it might not see in a traditional college experience
Hmm.
setting, were they able to access those programs in a different
Absolutely.
capacity, obviously?
Absolutely. Yeah, each program has requirements. And
Okay.
so, absolutely, you will see at those schools all sorts of needs, varying levels of needs. Often, students that had maybe done a couple years at their public school, and parents are like, they're just not ready. They need more, but they've aged out, or we've
Yeah.
kind of exhausted all the programming here, and so ready to move on. But yeah, absolutely, every disability, IQ, anything you can think of. So it's really about kind of investigating just like you would, what college fits me, which program fits me and my needs. And so that is part of
Oh,
what this experience is for
interesting.
families too. Like they're touring, they're looking, they're applying,
Yeah.
they're making sure that they're meeting the eligibility criteria that those schools are setting out as well.
That's so interesting because I'll be really honest, I've never heard of
Hmm.
and it could just be that I've never worked in the high school setting or in a transition program, right? Which I don't think makes it right either, because I feel like that's something that all special education teachers should know about, that there are these programs out there and that these are options for families. And I think, do you feel that a lot of families don't know that this is available to them?
Absolutely. I mean, that was a theme that came through too, as parents are like, can you spread the word? Will your work help spread the word about these programs? And I
Yeah,
think schools are scared sometimes to recommend things that aren't their own because we just live in a litigious society, right? And we also have an obligation to provide FAPE. So it's like, yes, we want to be able to say these are the things that we offer within the school district. And how do you kind of bridge that? Here are resources for you as an adult or as a parent that are outside of what we're not recommending, we're just
yeah,
sharing, right? And so I think that's always like a really hard line
it is.
that we as teachers and directors and school people kind of walk that line. Like here I can tell you, here's a list of everything you're going to have to go explore, right? But how do we walk that path? But yeah, I do think there's an awareness piece. They're also very small programs. So, once they're full, which is another aspect, right? You might be on the wait list for a while for some of these.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't even think about that.
And they're
Where,
expensive. They're very expensive.
yeah, so not a lot of access to a lot of families sometimes.
Hmm. Right.
So interesting. I love this though. How interesting.
Yeah.
How fun. So I am gonna like turn a little bit. I told Mandy I had some I had some ask the director questions that I forgot about,
Ooh.
and he knows this. Unless I write it down,
You thought of it now?
it like leaves my brain. It
Yeah.
does. And I did think of it. Okay, so a couple weeks ago when Ariel and I were doing our ESY conversation,
Mhm.
we were thinking like the unique need. Okay. And when do you see unique need? And we kind of asked everyone, we're like, have you seen a unique need? Or if you're a director, when do you use that unique need for ESY? And I feel like it varies director to director, right? Some are like, oh yeah, that's unique need. Sure, go with that. And some are like, we don't do unique need, and that is very
Mhm.
rare, and we shouldn't be moving in that direction. And I
Mhm.
guess my question for you is, where do you sit as a director with unique need when it comes to ESY?
Mhm.
And what are some of those unique needs, if you can think of them, not to put you on the spot,
Yeah.
that you've seen?
Hmm. I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I think unique need can easily be, I don't want to say abused, but like you're overqualifying kids. And so I think the framework that I always go back to is least restrictive environment, and ESY would fall under that too, right? We don't want to over, we want kids to just be kids in their setting, right? And so where do we get the most bang for our buck? What is the least amount of service to get the greatest impact? And so I
Yep.
think when we frame it like that, it helps us with our ESY piece too, as well as there's eligibility and all everything. But unique needs is a little gray, right? And
Yeah.
so I probably am somewhere in the middle. I don't say we never do that because that's just not true. But I want to be careful that we're not overusing that as this way to over-identify kids for ESY too. So with that said, I think one of the best examples of unique needs that I can think of is a long time ago, I was in a different district and we had a student who just had significant anxiety
Mm,
and they were going to transition to a new school. And so we knew that we would lose so much time. Given all of the data that we've had from other transitions, we
mhm.
knew that we would lose so much time at the beginning of the school year getting the student comfortable with the building
Right.
that we designed an ESY program where this kid literally went into the building, did a walkthrough, did the schedule, looked at all the site, and we did it multiple times. Multiple times. We had staff come in and meet the student. And so we did this to help ease that transition so we could have an easier start to the school year. And so that was a unique need. We
Yeah.
knew we'd lose time. We knew we'd lose weeks if we didn't do something. And so I would say that's like the best example of unique needs that I can think of. The other thing you were talking about with Ariel Al about ESY was speech.
Yeah.
And some districts don't do anything with speech. I've always been a proponent of making sure that we're servicing that need. So I feel like I always have a handful of students that qualify for speech ESY every year too. So I
Interesting.
would tell people not to shy away from that if it's a need, but just make sure you have your data.
Right. I think what makes it hard though is like we can't find speech pathologists. So if you're a speech pathologist out there, please go to school. Or if you want to be one or you're in
Mhm,
limbo or we are looking for you in Minnesota because I
mhm.
honestly I think that's the biggest need that I hear from most school districts is speech path and not having people to provide those
Yeah.
services, which again I think leads to that ESY conversation.
Yeah. And you don't have to do ESY in the summer. Extended school year can happen whenever. So I think that's another thing for schools to think about too. What is the specific need? What am I targeting? So often the regression kids obviously need that summer burst because
Right.
that's our longest break and we need to address the regression. But sometimes for unique needs or other capacities, it might mean extending the school year in different places, after school breaks, things like that, where you might be able to capture some of those services in a different way.
It's always interesting to hear different perspectives like this because I think this is where, and I've talked about this in my first episode, is when you don't work in multiple different districts or with multiple different directors in your career, I think it's really hard to get stuck in a certain place.
Hmm.
I feel like we get taught one thing in one place because that's
Hmm.
the way that that's the norm. And then
Yep.
we move to a different place and it's like that's not actually the norm. MDE actually says this, and this is how we interpret that.
Yes.
But it's hard unless you have your hand in multiple different places because it does feel comfortable to stay in one place. We've all been there. You and I have been there.
Hmm.
You do your career at a certain district and then you go somewhere and you're like, "Oh, I guess I never thought about that," or "Oh, I've never done it that way." And when you say ESY doesn't have to be over the summer, it's such an interesting mind shift because I think
Hmm.
that's hammered into our heads in
Yeah.
districts that
Hmm.
that's the way that we do things. And I think that's kind of like those practices I see across the board when I'm in certain districts is well, we've always done it this way. And that's
Right.
the way that we do it. And I'm like, but that's not that's not what MDE says. It's just the interpretation that came down from the director working with you.
Right, right. Yeah, we all, I mean, have our own unique flair, right, as a
Yeah, for
director.
sure.
And so we develop a process and a procedure for the
Mhm.
guidance that is given to us. And sometimes, we take it to a best practice, and sometimes we're like, this is what we do for sanity, and it's not right or wrong, it just is. And so I think that is a consideration though, as you're hearing things, right? Is like, how do
Yeah.
you do it and why do you do it that way? And those are really great questions to ask in any setting because sometimes you're like, well, if the answer is because we've always done it this way, we we might want to think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, and that's kind of the heart of like where this came from. This idea for me is just I've worked with so many amazing people, and I feel like everyone brings something different and exciting to the table and a different perspective and a new way to look at things. And I know you do this just as much as I do. Sometimes I'm like, hold on, I need to ask like three people and I'll
Yes.
get back to you because I need to figure out if my thinking, I did that actually is not to like put Dave on the spot here today, but like thinking of Dave, I was like, okay, I asked one person and I was like, that aligns with my thinking, but I don't know if it's right. And then I
Mhm.
called Dave and his was completely different. And I was like, oh, shoot,
Mhm.
I guess you're right. I didn't think of it that
Right.
way.
In
But
your perspective too, right? Like, have I had an MDE complaint about this before? Well, I'm probably going to treat that differently than the person who hasn't, right? And
yes.
so all of those things factor into whatever answer or guidance is
I think
being given.
100%. So what I would love to do, and I plug this on every episode, is I hope and I want people to start asking questions like on the videos, in different various places, because obviously I would love Mandy to come back and just do kind of an ask the
Mhm.
director question and answer session, because I think those are always so fun, because I feel like in some districts people don't have as much access to directors as they do in like our smaller charters that you and I have worked in,
Yep.
or even in some big districts some directors are accessible and some aren't, and I think there is a lot to be said about actually having those open conversations with higher level administration to get a fuller understanding of why
Hmm.
that's a hard no or why this is a yes, because I think sometimes there's like this director living in Oz that comes down and says no. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like
Yeah.
I think of like our big districts you and I have worked in, and it's like so and so said no, and you're down there going, but why did they say no? And I don't
Right.
fully understand that. Which again is the heart of why I want these conversations to happen, because I think there's a lot of us that have questions that we're like, well, I don't really get that fully, but I don't want to ask too many follow-up questions about
Hmm.
it.
Yeah.
Um,
And the why is so important.
mm,
And often when you're just scrambling to write an IEP, sometimes you don't have the capacity for a why in that exact moment. So to have these videos to reference later is kind of a gift for those
yeah,
people that want to know,
I hope so.
but maybe don't have the capacity at this exact moment.
Right. So what I would love to do today is any questions that you have around transitions, any questions around Mandy's dissertation that you want to know more about these tuition-based transition programs, which I think are super fascinating. I'm actually going to get kind of nerdy and look into them because Mandy knows I
I
get
can
kind
send
of
a
nerdy on
list.
certain things. Yeah. And that's
You can
okay.
also Google my dissertation. I'm pretty sure it's on like Google Scholar. So if you really want to nerd out, feel
I
free.
will. I think that's amazing. Just like with Brittany, I plugged her stuff and we're going to plug yours. If you want to look more into Mandy's dissertation, I will find the link and I will drop it in the comments below this video for you to explore more. But if there are any questions that you have for her, that please leave them for us and I will have Mandy answer them. And we'll have Mandy come back and just talk more director talk because I do love to pick her brain.
I love it. Thanks for asking me to be on today. This was really a fun way to spend my afternoon.
Yeah, it's always fun. I like, and then I get to see all my favorite people.
I love it.
That's
I
my
love
favorite
it.
thing about this is it just brings all my favorite people together to kind of talk about things that we all feel a little nerdy about, and that's okay. Uh,
We all
because
have our nerd thing.
we do,
We do.
we definitely do, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
It's
Uh,
good.
but I appreciate you joining me today, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks.